Hello, everyone. Absolute pleasure to be with you today and part of the education session by the World Federation of Hemophilia. And today we're going to talk about the clinical trials. My name is Johnny Mahlangu. In brief, I'm going to talk about what is the process being followed to bring treatment to the public. What are the reasons for conducting clinical trials? What are the phases of treatment development in the clinical trials? And what are the critical components of clinical trial conduct? Just to remind you that the process of bringing treatment to be used ultimately by all of us has not changed in many decades, not even in the context of COVID-19. In a very brief fashion, the process follows 3 steps. There is a preclinical phase, there is a clinical phase, and then there is a regulatory authority phase. In the preclinical phase, this is the phase at which the drug is discovered, and in fact, its effect on the particular disease is being evaluated. And this is called proof of concept. This has obviously elements of deep scientific inquiry. And in fact, if that proof of concept is established, the drug then moves on from being tested in animals to being tested in humans in the clinical trials. In the clinical trials per se, which involve humans, we establish the safety and the efficacy of the drug that is being developed. We also establish the dose of the drug as well as the quality of the treatment that is being developed. The clinical trial is an important component, and I'll speak to the various phases later. This is usually followed by a report that contains the data that is evaluated by the regulatory authorities such as the FDA, EMEA, and many others around the world. And their job is to evaluate the safety and efficacy and quality of the data that has been generated in the clinical trial, and to make a call as to whether the drug can actually be released and be licensed for use by the general public. If one looks at the importance of the clinical trials are actually the research tools that we use to advance knowledge and of course to optimize patient care. Without the clinical trials, one would probably find it hard to be able to advance the knowledge that we have with regard to diseases and their treatment, and of course to make sure that the patients get the benefit. Perhaps more importantly, clinical trials are conducted in humans in order to establish if the treatment that is being developed works or does not work in human. And perhaps more importantly, this does not happen as a once-off process. It takes a number of phases. The phases of the clinical trial can be summarized into these 3 cartoons, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. In phase 1, we are interested in the safety of the treatment being developed. So a limited number of individuals are exposed to the treatment. And of course, at that stage, we are looking for the most optimally efficacious and safe molecule that would be used in the subsequent phases. In phase 2 of the clinical development, which is usually conducted in humans, and as well as those individuals with the disease of interest, such as hemophilia, we expand the number of individuals that are exposed to the treatment that is being developed, in addition to obviously narrowing down the molecules that may well be of use in the development. And in phase 3, we significantly expand the number of individuals. We are looking specifically not only for safety, we're also looking for efficacy of the treatment, but more importantly, now we've got a very limited number of molecules that may well work in those individuals. So these are, of course, the 3 phases of development. We do know that, in fact, There are other phases that are important, such as the phase 4 that we'll talk about later. And talking about the phase 4, it is very, very important that one emphasizes the importance of registries and other ancillary tools that we have in the gathering of additional data. What I also want to emphasize perhaps is the interlink between the various role players who are responsible for the successful conduct of clinical trials. Most importantly is the participants or the patients that participate in clinical trials. What we do all the time, we evaluate the risk-benefit ratio such that the patients benefit out of the clinical trial. In the context of many parts of the world, we also ensure that the patients have got access to the treatment beyond the clinical trial. And of course, clinical trials have to have an element of social value and other components that we look for that justify why we do clinical trials in patients. The second important component is the role of the investigators. Amongst other things, we ensure that they have the relevant education, they have the relevant expertise, the site capacity to be able to conduct the clinical trial according to the protocol, and of course they comply with all of what is required. The sponsors do not escape these accountabilities and responsibilities. They need to demonstrate a track record and compliance with the regulatory authorities. And more importantly, they need to generate reports, which reports will then on a regular basis throughout the clinical trials get presented to both the ethics committees as well as the health protection authorities, whose role is to review this data and to establish if in fact the clinical trial was conducted according to the protocols that they've already reviewed, and if not, to enforce that such conduct in fact is according to what they've approved. Perhaps more importantly, one needs to bear in mind that clinical trials often are conducted in settings where there is experience. It is important that if you're interested in participating in a clinical trial, that you contact your nearest healthcare provider or center to be able to guide it where the clinical trials are actually conducted, so that you can participate and contribute to the evolution of the treatment, which we're all excited about. That is all I had for you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi everyone, I'm Johnny Mahlangu from Johannesburg, and it is my pleasure for me to talk to you today about monitoring safety in clinical trials. The agenda for today is relatively short. I will first of all put safety in the context of drug development, and I'll try and allude to who's responsible for safety in clinical trials and what are the safety responsibilities of those individuals who are responsible for safety. Just to remind you that safety evaluation is central to all stages of drug development life cycle. It is certainly something that is kept in mind during the innovation and drug discovery phase. It is important in the preclinical phase when the drug is tested in vivo, in vitro, as well as ex vivo. Perhaps the most important part of safety is when the drug gets given to human beings, and that is during the clinical development phase. And I'll speak to the clinical development phase a bit more later. And the last phase is the post-marketing, where the drug is probably further evaluated for safety. If one looks at the safety in the clinical development phase, as you will recall, that there are a number of phases during the clinical development of the drug. We call them phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. And in fact, you can see that the kind of activities that are involved in each of these phases are many. The most important part is that each one of these phases has got safety aspect. safety evaluation in it. When one is looking at the phase 1, there is safety evaluation that takes place. When it's looking at phase 2, there is safety evaluation, and this is usually in the context of patients with the relevant disease. And of course, the phase 3 is important. In addition to the efficacy evaluation, there is also phase evaluation, safety evaluation. Safety evaluation goes beyond the licensing and approval of the drug. It certainly involves the post-marketing phase, where in some instances, in fact, the regulatory authorities may require submission of additional safety data as part of the approval. And of course, the most important question is, who's responsible for the safety of the drugs that are undergoing clinical trials? There are many role players. I've oversimplified the important role players here. And in my mind, the most important one is probably the sponsor of the drug, who's responsible, of course, for a large proportion of the safety aspect of their drug. And then, of course, we've got the investigator. These are individuals that interface between the sponsor and the trial participants. The regulatory authorities, including, of course, the government regulatory authorities, as well as the ethics committees, are also having a huge responsibility. And last but not least, the patients themselves actually are responsible for the safety. The question, of course, is what are these responsibilities? If one looks at the sponsor safety responsibilities, you can see that there are many. And I've listed a few here, which I think are very important. The sponsor is responsible for formulating a safety and monitoring and evaluation plan. They collect and categorize and review all of the adverse events during the conduct of the study. They appoint an independent monitoring committee that is going to review the safety data. They ensure that the participants have got insurance cover. They monitor compliance with the guidance that has been provided by the regulators and the ethics committees. And of course, the most important responsibility is to stop the exposure to the drug if the adverse event is serious and related to the drug itself. Moving on to the safety responsibilities of the investigator, these are many. They are nicely outlined in the Good Clinical Practice Guideline, but I've listed a few here. They monitor participant adverse events, report these adverse events to the sponsors and the ethics committees and the regulatory authorities. And of course, some of these adverse events may be classified as serious adverse events, in which case these need to be reported within 24 hours of the investigator knowing about them. They evaluate the adverse events in relation to the drugs, and of course, they stop the exposure if it is found that, in fact, the serious adverse event is related to the exposure to the drug. What are the responsibilities of the regulators? These are many as well. They ensure that the investigator and the sponsor comply with the safety monitoring, evaluation, and reporting plan. They evaluate all the safety data that is collected during the study, and they assess the risk-benefit ratio. And in fact, if the risk far outweigh the benefit, they stop the study in the majority of instances. And finally, the role of the participants in the safety monitoring and evaluation, their responsibility is to make sure that the events that happen whilst they were taking the drug are reported to the investigators, and these events, in fact, are catalogued and they are actually being acted upon. They are also responsible for availing themselves to assist the investigator in further evaluation of the relationship between the adverse events and the study drug. And of course, they should stop taking the drug if instructed to do so. These are some of the responsibilities that one may well assign to each of the important role players in monitoring and evaluating safety during the clinical trial. And of course, this is only during the clinical trial. We do know that data is generated outside clinical trials in the form of real-world evidence that some investigators may well undertake, and of course in the form of registries That is all I wanted to share with you, and thank you very much for your attention.